ancient artifacts, the truth in white and black.
Time Part 2, The Winding Path. I guess I had some time today. So where I left off with in Time Part 1 was, what can we use to measure time? Since we know that time is not dependent on any of the things we have been trained to assume it was, I'm going to tell you right now, this is one you're going to have to go through multiple times to get the implications of. Also, I always recommend you go back and look at the institutes I'm gonna bring up in a little bit. This might change somebody's life out there. So Pete, the solar calendar isn't universal. Matter of fact, there are multiple calendars based on the sun. Just for perspective, if you take your camera and take a picture of the sun every day for a year, the pattern you'll get is the pattern on the left. That's that figure 8 pattern called the analemma. If you want to try it, it's made by taking a picture at the exact time every day from the same location. This can be used to calculate multiple years. You should notice if you mapped out the whole year that the equinox points, like the vernal equinox we had this week, sit towards the intersection point in the middle of the figure 8. This can be used as the basic structure to calculate the year as well as planting cycles. Once again, note there are no straight lines here. There are no straight lines in nature. It's all cycles. This one cycle, the solar cycle, is a root for many calendars, which are in this definition just systems of measurement. Stick with me here. This is just the beginning. Note that these calendars based on the sun are useful, but they are not complete. That's why most cultures have multiple calendar systems. This is also why the Julian calendar became the Gregorian calendar. These aren't accurate over relatively long periods of time. But solar calculations are very necessary to make your farmer's almanac as well as your lunar cycles for moisture. So these are old sciences. To go into it a bit, hopefully not too much, solar science takes into account not just the yearly solar cycle, but the cycle of solar maximums and minimums. These involve sunspot activity, magnetic field reversals, and things like that. Then you have the moon phases, climatology, meteorology. It's whole sciences of how the lunar activity affects plants, how during the full moon there's more moisture in the soil due to lunar gravity, and during times like new moons or lunar eclipses, germinations increase. Then you have climate changes, atmospheric studies. None of these sciences are new, and they are all cyclical when mapped out over long enough periods. Even economic cycles, social cycles. And don't think this is some esoteric concept that isn't being studied at the highest levels. Now, as usual, a lot of this type of research always boils down to resource acquisition or war, which is basically about resource acquisition too, right? The money. So we go back to the Great Depression. For all of us watching this in 2024, I really think you should pay attention to this. The gentleman that had the unfortunate responsibility of being president at the time of the Great Depression of 1929 was Herbert Hoover. Now, to give you the cliff notes on the Great Depression, on September 8th of 1929, the stock market got overinflated for various reasons, which led to speculators being a bit too over-optimistic, which led to the value of many stocks being valued much higher than their worth. About 7 weeks later, on October 29th of the same year, the stock market plummeted. The Dow dropped over 190 points, and everybody started selling off their stock market shares. Many people lost their entire life savings. This eventually led to worldwide gross domestic product falling by an estimated 15%. Everybody was hit hard, and as people look around for someone to blame, they find President Herbert Hoover. Now, he tried to keep the federal budget balanced, but he failed. He encouraged businesses to stop laying people off, even funded public projects like building the Hoover Dam, but in the end, he couldn't stop it. Take note of that. He had no control over its beginning or its end. One thing he did do is funnel a lot of money into researching what actually caused the Great Depression. Out of this came the work of a man by the name of Edward R. Dewey. Now, Dewey was made chief economic analyst at the Department of Commerce and tasked with trying to figure out why the Depression occurred. He tried to find causality, a cause and effect relationship for the Great Depression, and they couldn't find one, especially looking at how the Great Depression spread across the entire world, which most of us don't even think about. Now, as they were trying to figure out what caused the Great Depression, what they began to see after trying to figure out the why was the what. What was happening? They looked back, they saw the embargo of 1807 that drove down U.S. trade 80%, the crisis of the 17th century in Scotland and others, and began to see a system of economic cycles, not just economic cycles, but population cycles and trends, species growth cycles and trends. Now, keep in mind, to this day, this is a public branch of our federal government. They still do this work. So while President Herbert Hoover lost the election in 1932 and FDR goes into the hot seat, Dewey and Dakin got to continue their life work and expand these ideas, which to this day, under the name of the Cycles Research Institute, produce data that support that these events, these economic booms and busts, are just a part of the natural cycle of our economic system. That there is a physics to this, a deeper medium that to this day modern science doesn't really identify, although they can trace the paths of these waves that occur in this medium. These guys at this point, close to 100 years, have been seeking a unified theory of cycles because they can trace these cycles and they can see them and how they affect each other to create these outcomes, such as these Great Depressions in these times that everybody's doing okay. Now, I don't want to lose focus on what this video is called, time, but I needed you guys to understand this ancient conceptualization of calendars, of cycle things to measure the passing and the places in these cycles of time was and is correct. These cycles of growth and inhibition, these booms and these busts, feasts and famine are all cyclical, and they all have their own rhythms. They're not the same. This is definitely not an invention of mine, nor is it something new. These guys collected research on everything, empirical research of all kinds. And when they put this data together, you get examples such as combinations of cycles. A 9-year combined with the 54-year, creating something that might look chaotic or something that might look like it just happened, but it's a combination of rhythms like a drum beat, like how sunspots cause higher growths of crops, which cause higher reproduction rate because people can eat better in a more peaceful era, and that'll cause an economic boom that'll eventually become a bust when the population grows too high. So we might not be able to verify the cause and effect, but we can verify that these cycles have happened from the beginning of time, and it's all rooted from sun cycles, weather cycles, food production, and the resulting public sentiment of all of these things can affect the stock market. And one last piece on this, they found these rhythms, these cycles, to be completely inevitable. Going back to the original purpose of this organization, when they studied the different countries that experienced the Great Depression, they found these rhythms, these cycles, to be inevitable. Going back to the original purpose of this organization, when they studied different countries' responses to the Great Depression, when they tried to do things like subsidize their exports, when they abandoned that gold standard, when we had regime changes in the U.S. and England, militarization in Germany with Adolf Hitler, job creation, laws to reduce unemployment, the Great Depression still ended relatively all over the world at the same time. 1931 to 1933. No matter what the politicians did, no matter what the people did to try to affect it, they realized they can augment it, aka make it worse, or amplify it, try to make it better or smoother, but they could not stop these cycles. So if they wanted to do something more impactful, they could do that. If they can maybe try to blunt it a little bit, they could, but they could not stop the entire cycle. So remember, cycles, waves, rhythms are motion. Think about your tire on the road, your running shoe on the track. These rhythms need something to move in. Newton's third law. For every action is an equal and opposite reaction. For the planets to move, for your feet to move your body, for your tires to peel out, you can put energy into the system, but that energy has to come out somewhere else. You need a medium that presents a contradictory force, friction. So when we talk about the creation of a calendar or any other form of time measurement, we have to acknowledge that time is completely independent of the means that we use to measure it. Modern science doesn't take this into account regularly. If you know what the four fundamental forces are, you should also know that in modern physics, they keep these principles separate from actual consideration of motion. They're missing something. It's a clear blind spot. Look at the language these experts use. It's descriptive, and through their own admission, the theories are successful in describing these things, but they're still just that. Theories that work under most circumstances. Now, don't get me wrong, don't go try to fly without wings, but what I'm saying is there are clear missing pieces that separate these concepts from being utilitarian versus descriptive. This is all descriptive because they are not taking the medium or the motion itself into context. They know there's a necessary contact medium necessary for these pulls and pushes and for these things to rest or to move or even remain still, but they nowhere in these descriptions can describe the medium. This is actually the work CERN and these organizations do with these hadron colliders when they discuss unified theories, theories of everything. Now, until the moment we can actually manipulate these base building blocks like these quarks or these leptons and these forces, time can only be used as a measuring tool. They use time in these equations concerning speed, velocity, and momentum, and they also acknowledge particle physics can only be half of the equation due to existence of waves, but they still have not captured time. So while these guys are still trying to figure out economic cycles, bees still hover. Hummingbirds still hover. So movement in this physical medium definitely doesn't require distance. Movement itself is operating in time. Time is a fundamental building block all by itself. All things that move, move in time. Everything is moving, including the sky, in time. So until we can utilize it, the best thing we can keep shooting at is understanding it. So going back to this slide from time part 1, you look around you, everything is moving and not at a constant rate either. You definitely have cycles, these obloid things, not circular. So how do we get a semi-accurate calendar? One that on average can be anywhere near correct. Now, for all my guys who for years have been around talking about how kings and rulers have added years, taken away years, crunched events down, you're absolutely right. But how do you prove them wrong? If you can't even tell me what calendar your culture traditionally used, how you can calculate day from night, planting cycles, hunting cycles, conception and birthing cycles, how can you create something better than what you were given? That's where I'm going with this one. This is why, just like my Mississippi Kingdom work, this is definitely going to be a multi-parter. So to introduce you to the players for the various parts, in part 1, I introduced King Judea, a Sumerian king from the southern Mesopotamia. Now, by his reign, we can prove that there was actually antiquity to the 7-day calendar. But also, if you go back to time part 1, I did point out that that was not the only way to calculate time. How the Kim had a 10-day week, how the Romans had an 8-day week, the Maya had a 13-day cycle, but somehow this 7-day week ended up permeating the world. Go on and go back and look at time part 1. Or you can use your own resources and look at Constantine the Great, born in Nisus or modern-day Nice, Serbia. The Council of Nice is spoken about for a number of things. One of the things it did was codify that 7-day week, which means that thereafter, wherever Rome conquered, they took the 7-day week in their calendar, which was Julian at the time. Now, Constantine is a whole conversation to be had by itself. himself how he was serious and how he even took the arbitrary choices he made and made law. But remember, even though he established that Roman Christian church, he stayed Pontifex Maximus until he died. So he was the head of the Christian church and the regular Roman church. But he made changes that affected most of the world. So when you consider this, look at this map. This was the Roman Empire of Constantine's time. This whole area all of a sudden had to enforce upon its subjects the 7-day week, with the holy day called Day Solis every 7 days, the Lord's Day, and the 12-month calendar. The Julian that was proven to be inaccurate was already used in this area. Then they had to do further calculations to implement this. This is a lot of cultures, people. This is a lot of religions. This is affecting a lot of people's history in a lot of languages. Also told they have to follow this system of measuring time. Now they have to figure out how to work it into their cultures. They have to adjust their systems of worship. Do you think that was easy? Because it wasn't. They had to adjust a 10-day week to a 7-day week, that 8-day week, the 5-day weeks. All of these different systems had to bow down and adjust to this 7-day week. And if you didn't do it, what were you? You were an atheist. You were a heretic. Now you have to think about this. To this day, at least 6 cultures, including Ethiopia, still use a Julian calendar. It's a lot of social effort to change a whole calculation system, which is why someone concerned with history, this stuck out like a sore thumb to me. It's something that needed to be addressed. I mean, all of a sudden, they have to recalculate when things happened in their history on this new calendar. Nobody knows their own birthday. God forbid what day or year a war happened, right? Now all of a sudden you thought you had a week to do some court paperwork and it's due tomorrow. Your taxes late. It's the 17th of the month. You done missed Saturnalia, the biggest party of the year. The Ides of March have come and gone. I mean, all your sense of continuity in life are gone, right? All your sense of perpetuity, your consistency in life is moving around because they moving this calendar. How hard would your day be today if all of a sudden it was next week or next month? And this happened multiple times and happened locally across multiple regions. This is why when we find ourselves in a world of open and shared history, all of these histories stopped matching. They aren't matching anymore. Through these calendar reforms, these calendar variations, people like Scaliger that will get to interpreting things into their own ways, and even something called double dating. Because don't forget, the Gregorian calendar is introduced in 1582, and then you have different cultures dating things differently because they're still on the Julian calendar. They're on the Islamic Hijri calendar. They're on their local calendar. It got really confusing for most of the world. The Eastern Orthodox Church, the way people are calculating their holidays, everything. So what can you trust? What you can trust is what you can see with your own eyes. Look up. Sirius. Literally the brightest star in the night sky. Now, don't get me wrong. Sirius moves just like everything else, but it's considered a fixed star. Like Arcturus, Rigel, Algol, or Algol, Antares, Regulus, Betelgeuse. What that means is in conjunction with the sun and combinations of fixed stars, you get a more accurate representation of time passing. This is how we know that during the 365-day year, the Earth usually rotates 366 times. This is why sidereal calendars are shorter than solar days. This is an increase in accuracy. The Gregorian calendar sits at 365.2425 days. The quote-unquote exact length of a solar day is calculated by today's standard is 365.2422 days. So when you look at the sun and calculate that average, because remember, these are all variables, so they're all averages, then you add Sirius to that, and you add Aldebaran, Regulus, whichever ones your particular culture chose. All of these other objects, you get a mean or average for the length of the day. That's the truth of what a day is and what it's always been. It's been an average calculation. They can put it in fancy words and start talking about algorithms and logistic calculations. But trust me when I tell you, the same thing the ancients did is the same thing we do today, just with more tools. Here I listed a few cultures that did this. As you see, most only use the sun plus 1 to 3 other celestial bodies because that's really all you need. And plus, these cultures also had a sense of precession of the equinoxes and the cyclical nature of these things. So closing that door out, we get to what will be the next issue at hand. And if you want to take a look at this before I move on, you have the serpent mound tracking the sun and Draco. You have Woodhenge tracking the solstices, the equinoxes, Sirius and Aldebaran. You have Stonehenge calculating from the Pleiades cluster to the sun. You have the Dogon using the Sirius star and the sun. So you see that there are different ways to get to this measurement. So back to where we're headed, history. How is the world's history put into a unified standard? Now, when we get to Pope Gregory the 13th in 1582, he had been tasked to figure out how to straighten out the mess that was created by using the calendar that we call the Julian calendar. After almost 20 years of research and debating, the finally settled on calendar we call Gregorian was accepted in 1582. Now, this was only originally accepted in Catholic countries. Let's be honest here. This is a time when most people in Europe, the Near East, and these areas were in survival mode. This was an agricultural time. The average Catholic couldn't have cared less what a calendar said, but this set up a worldwide conflict in record keeping. This is a world where land was wealth and books and education was luxury. The first thing to point out is at the time this calendar was not called the Julian calendar. It was just the Reformed calendar, the Roman calendar. Even that was only spread out as far as those that honored the Roman Church. Even east to west in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine recordings of the time and historical events were slightly different than the calculations in the West, where we have modern-day Italy. So when events were calculated, they would say things happened in 1 year, it may have happened in a totally different year or even decade. If you look at the latest countries adopted this century well into the 20th century in the 1900s, which brings us to another point. There was no concept for a century in the 16th century. That's not even how they conceptualized things happening. I mean, they had orders of events, but no concept of a century or even a decade. They spoke in terms of lifetimes, eras, and those lives were what? Cycles. This is what they mean when they talk about the various ages of men. There was no concept for decades, centuries, no concept at all for millennia when the Bible was written. So as far as the church was concerned, even though many cultures had histories, chronicles, kings lists, astrological sites, honored grave sites, they needed to invent their own conceptualization of history, which now, post-Council of Trent, included their new method of timekeeping, the Gregorian calendar. In comes Joseph Justus Scaliger, a French son of a scholar and physician who took up the task of pretty much the invention of modern chronology. Now, he wrote at least 6 books with others attributed to him, but his main 2 that are of note are the ones you see here: De Emendatione Temporum, the correction of time, and one more, the Thesaurus Temporale, where he took the past works of Eusebius and attempted the same feat, to chronologize them. Now, this definitely was a gargantuan effort. I mean, imagine waking up one day and saying to yourself, I think every historian before me was wrong. That's not my words, that's his. This man took the available histories he had from all over the world, known to the Romans, which at the time included Britain all the way to Bengal, including Egypt and the islands past the Pillars of Hercules. We'll leave that there for your consideration. Then you have to ask yourself, why the Thesaurus Temporum? Why Eusebius? Because this was church history. For all of you guys that's following my Mississippi Kingdom work and wonder why I also do astrological recording, because this is how history is kept. Scaliger, being a man of the church, had 100% faith in Eusebius's writing. So you have a whole world of data that he could have drawn from, but this man of the faith put most of his trust into Greek church sources. Sextus Africanus, Georgius Sicilis, to synchronize the Near Eastern history with the Greco-Roman history. He compiled these sources and created his own timeline. Now, I'll say this was an honorable effort, but anybody who studied history and math will tell you it's real easy to make mistakes, whether on the side of miscalculation, mistranslation, or simple misbelief. So we'll honor his methodology, but he definitely made mistakes, which later scholars attempted to correct. Notwithstanding, this was work done for the church. It had to agree with the church history. If anything went against the Bible, it had to be removed. Scaliger used maps from Mercator, who was active too at the time, genealogies, previous histories of cultures, books from other mathematicians, astrology, and combine all of these into complex volumes that people have been arguing about ever since. Lunar calendars, solar calendars. I mean, he even argued that the Egyptians were wrong in their recordings of the Egyptian Sotis calendar. This is the man who, even though it was James Ussher who conceptualized it, stamped that Earth was created around 4000 BC. This is why when you look at early archaeology and anthropology, they refuse to date anything or anybody older than 4000 BC. His work had long-reaching implications we are just getting over now. He debated dates and histories of cultures of thousands of years older than his own. And in the process, for biblical historicity and his chronology, if it didn't fit the Bible, it wasn't real. And many came after him to attempt their corrections of this. But remember, this is still an era of supremacy of the church, especially during the Inquisition and the Crusades. So you would lose your head if you disagree with the Bible. So just to name a few before I go into detail in part 3, I have Petavius, the inventor of year 1. He was a French Jesuit theologian, and he published the new chronology of the doctrine of chronology. Then you have Isaac Newton that we're all familiar with, who noticed how off the standardized history was, but he knew it would be off with his head if he went against the church. So he made sure that he did his work in private on his chronology, and it wasn't published until after he died. His nephew published it for him, and it's been debated as well for 100+ years afterwards. Then you have Theodor Mommsen, a German scholar with a love for Roman history, who instead of assuming everybody was wrong like Scaliger, he cross-referenced the available Roman historians who included astrology and other methods of dating in their actual writings. He came up with his series of chronologies that were more streamlined and acceptable because they agreed with what came before him. He was the beginning of an acceptable methodology for dating past events, and there were many more that came after Scaliger and tried their hand at this thing we call history. You have two Austrians who used the Peloponnesian War as a landmark in time due to the rare triple eclipse that happened during the war, Senzel and Appelzer. You have Morozov, who combed through the chronologies of the countries. He has some interesting perspective on Chinese dating due to China using a Saturn-Jupiter cycle instead of a solar-lunar or fixed star system. Then you have Fomenko that expanded on Morozov's ideas. Recently, Fomenko's books have regained a lot of traction as well, coming out of Russia. Then there's Butterfield. Then you have one of my favorites, Godfrey Higgins, with his 2-volume Anacalypsis. And then you have the one that we all love to hate, Champollion. But as you guys know, I'll be the first to tell you, the most important thing about time is you can't get it back. Today, we've established a root understanding of cycles, and how not only are they something that's believed in, but something that's used by the rulers and the wealthy. We've gone through the use of fixed stars to triangulate and get better and more accurate time measurements going through our celestial reality. We went through how we developed the historical record and how it was solidified post-Council of Trent by the Roman Catholic Church with the Gregorian calendar. And now we're going to end up looking at the chronologists who had to make corrections to the history that we were all given. Now, for everybody that's watching and listening, I need you to understand this is important because understanding what happened in the past dictates what can be done and what can be perceived as done in the future. If we don't even understand what time is, a basic building block for our reality, how can we even conceive of a future? We only have so much time, y'all. People spent their entire lives constructing these things for you. These past, futures, histories, and ideas. We only have so long to get it right. I'll see you next time in Time Part 3.